Good. I think let's get into it and let's just have a look what's happening this afternoon. We're going to start with looking at the spirit of the book and certainly making links to the syllabus, which is not only going to be that part of the presentation, but of course woven throughout. But the heart of the presentation is to do with the contextual studies, the depth, the concluding, and that really is what we're concentrating on, interrogating historical sources through critical inquiry, which this book is all about. And then certainly we're going to start with assessment and having a look at some sample of assessment, and of course we'll finish with some questions. So let's begin with the spirit of the book.
Okay, thanks for coming everyone. The spirit of the book probably sounds a bit strange, whether books are supposed to have spirit or not, but we do think there's something we can say about this book that sort of sums it up in an overall sense. So I want to start with the cover, which is often a most neglected and overlooked part of a book. People just sort of go past it into the real book, but to us the cover itself is a real part of the book. So that's the cover of the book, and most of you have probably seen this already. And the question is, why is the cover significant as opposed to the contents? Well, the cover is significant because of this photo, which was interestingly chosen, and I'll tell you about that later. But it represents, firstly, an event that's shaped and is still shaping the modern world, and that is what the book's about. Events that have shaped and are continuing to shape the modern world. So one reason for choosing that photo. The second is that it depicts the best of humankind and the worst. And some of you may have recognised the photo, and you probably know where roughly it's from anyhow. This is from Syria. It's from a city in the deep south-west of Syria called Daraa, which has been under siege for 7 or so years. The siege has almost been broken now, and it's a tragic story, and we'll come back to that as well. This book deals with the best of humankind and the worst as well. And this is the table of contents. These are the chapters. Most of you have probably seen these. If you haven't, I think it's in the handout you've got. So I won't dwell, except to say that threaded through there are the best and worst of humanity. I'll tell you a few things about the contents. Firstly, there are 17 chapters, or maybe there are 18, depending how you count. Of the 17, 11 are in print form in the book itself, and they're also in digital form, so you can access them either way if you buy the book. The 6 other chapters are in digital form only, and they include 4 of the topic chapters from the book. So the chapters about an historical content topic. And there's also a proposed digital 18th chapter, which will be released whenever QCAA changes its focus for the external assessment. And as you know, as Julie's going to reinforce, the current focus is on the Vietnam War. Now, when that runs out in 2 or 3 years' time, there will be a new digital chapter which will deal with whatever focus QCAA chooses in a few years' time. So it's going to keep the book up to date in that assessment sense. The third reason is that the cover image is interrogated as an historical source of evidence in the book. The cover is interrogated, which is a bit unusual for a book. And almost every image in the book is also interrogated. I wanted to say almost, I wanted to say every, but I had to say almost because a couple at this stage have still slipped through. They're interrogated in this sort of way. This feature will appear frequently in the book chapters. It's a source named, numbered, and as well as that, it's got a set of questions underneath a heading responding to the marketing poster. What we've done as well, though, for many of the images, is not done it that formally, and instead throughout the whole book itself, you'll see things that look like this, where instead you get an image, you'll get a caption. In this case, it's a 2-line caption about this scene from 9/11. And then there are 5 lines of questions. I think there are 6 questions altogether about the image. Now, we've done this just to break up the style a bit and also to save a bit of space. You can see that this is a more economical way of doing it as well. Your students will get used, we hope, very quickly to the idea that a picture is not a decoration. A picture is every bit as valuable, if not more so, than much of the text that's in the book itself. And I think they'll get used to the idea that here's the caption in black, and in a slightly different colour, blue here, we've got the corresponding questions that go with it. That interrogation of the cover photo is in the introduction to the book, which again is a bit unusual. When you read an introduction to a book, normally it just says, this is the book and we hope you enjoy it. In this one, we've done an interrogation of that photo. There are 13 questions that we ask about it. The first question we ask is, what are the main things you notice in the photograph? Really basic, simple question, just to get people located. I can't show you the whole 13, but I'll show you the 12th question, which is, should citizens ever have the right to take up arms against an oppressive authoritarian government as the Dara rebels did? Now, I'm sure as history teachers you can see there must have been something going on between question 1 and question 12. And indeed there has been a whole lot of questioning which leads to this point here. There is a 13th question as well, and it's the question which goes back to, do we end up with tentative knowledge whenever we get stuck into something historical, particularly something as recent and as problematic as Dara? So it goes back to the nature of history, whereas this question has driven the students back into their own souls, if you like, to make their own judgments about something. And so that's, if you like, a sort of continuum of questioning, I guess. Most simple, what do you see? All the way through to some very challenging questions as well. That's the model, and you'll see that repeated a lot through the book. Not all questions can be interrogated like that. If they were, the book would be, I think, 1,800 pages long and would cost you about $3,000. So we couldn't do all the sources in the way that we've done some of these, but a lot of them have been done that way. We hope the students will very soon pick up the idea of depth questioning. Okay? The fourth reason is that the choice of the cover image was controversial and debated. Harriet might like to come into the room at this point. She was part of the debate. This is the photo we've got on the cover. Originally, a lot of the authors wanted this photo. And what ensued was a very interesting to and fro, wasn't it, between the authors. Different authors had different feelings about it. I'll tell you roughly what was going on, or simply what was going on. Two images compared. And so we have people saying things about how upsetting these images were. Now, it'd be very interesting to say to you, which is the more upsetting of these two images? Can we do a straw poll very quickly? I didn't plan to do this, Julie, sorry. If you had to choose the more upsetting image of those two, who would choose that? Who would choose this? And who would find it hard to make a decision? Yeah, sorry, I should have given you the third option, shouldn't I? But it looks like more people feel this. Well, we had people saying that this actually is more upsetting and therefore we can't use that. This one, by comparison, is optimistic. Now, I'm not saying that people who find this more upsetting or this more optimistic are wrong, but isn't it interesting insight into perspective? Perspective, one of the key concepts of the curriculum. We had also a number of authors, including myself, who emailed saying, excuse me, are we dealing here with disaster porn? In other words, the exploitation of images without due regard for the people involved. So that swirled around, and out of it came the decision we go this way. And I'm very happy with that decision in that respect, because it was great. It was very challenging to then get in and try and find 13 questions worth asking about that to really get deep into it. I've just listed over here the 3 of the 7 concepts of history that I think are reflected in what we've just been doing with these 2 images. Empathy for these people, perspectives, we see these differently, contestability again. Now, interrogating the cover image reflects the key elements of historical inquiry. I won't dwell on these except to say you'll recognise these terms. They're ones you work with, deal with. They're all part of the official agenda. They're all part of what we do in classrooms. The inquiry process, concepts, content, some general capabilities like ethical understanding, for example, which would have come through in that previous example there. Links with the modern world, links with students' lives we'll come back to. You'll recognise all of that when you read the introduction and you'll read the 13 questions. And I hope you'll agree that that's what it's been doing. And there's a much more detailed treatment of historical inquiry in chapter 1, a digital chapter, History and Historical Inquiry. I haven't told Harriet yet, but at the moment it's running at 12,000 words. She told me I could have 8. This, I think, will be an important chapter in the book. It goes really into depth into what do we mean by history and historical inquiry. And I think students will find that a good sort of framework with which to work.
So links with the syllabus. So what we want to focus on is really the subject matter, because the syllabus tells us this, and these are quotes, that this is really the basis of student learning. And it's in the subject matter that we find the concepts, the skills, the knowledge and the understanding that are described in the objectives. So this is the heart. And here we have this being described, the subject matter, not once, but of course, 52 times and all exactly the same. And of course, this is the challenge that we face. How do you put flesh on these bones? Because the syllabus doesn't give us that flesh. And this is where this history text is going to actually give you that flesh to show you how you can, in a meaningful, engaging way, teach the history of whatever you choose in those topics in each of those units. So when you actually have a look at this subject matter, this is one of the great things that the syllabus gives us. It gives us a really nice structure. And of course there the syllabus identifies very clearly, you know, what is the quantum? What's the timing as such? And the syllabus provides that. This is what the book has followed. And equally we've followed in terms of that timing. So we're going to start with the context. And of course this small phrase is quite key to what we have to do in terms of making decision. The phrase aspect of the topic. What is the aspect of the topic that we're going to do within whatever the unit theme is? So by way of just trying to explain what context is, I mean what it does, it establishes what goes around that aspect of the topic that's going to make meaning for the depth study. So really the big decision is, what is the aspect of the topic that I'm going to choose to teach, and therefore ask the question, what is it that I need to do in order to build understanding around it, sort of almost like setting it up. So when you get into, you know, the depth study, that is set up well. Now in the textbooks there's 2 approaches that we give. So we've got the approach 1, and it's the background history, and that's what most of the chapters do. And by way of saying the French Revolution, so you've got the depth study begins in 1789, and therefore the context study is the history prior to that actually sets up the context for this revolution. The second approach is what we call the big picture approach. And again, I'll give the example of a Unit 2 with the Indigenous movement for rights. And what that is, so say the context study is that big picture. It's the whole phenomenon. From when the rights or the civil rights movement begins here in Australia in the 1920s with, you know, Frederick Maynard and his establishment of the first progressive Indigenous or Aboriginal association, right through to the Uluru Statement of the Heart. Big picture, and then the depth study goes in and takes a portion of that movement, and looking at the land rights movement since 67. So another feature of the context is, how do you get kids engaged? How do you actually get them into the topic? And one of the features is the hook, and we've done that through every chapter begins with a compelling photograph, along with a story. Most of the pictures are quite contemporary. they're all interesting, they're all engaging, and in this instance it's a very local one, you know, in terms of Post Office Square in Brisbane. And I'll just show you, and just flicking through, I've just chosen one from each of the units. Here we have from the movements of the modern world, linked to the environmental movement. Here with Nazi Germany, of course last year coming out of Charlottesville, makes a beautiful juxtaposition of Nazis, Nuremberg, torchlight ceremonies, and of course with terrorism. And again, you know, Manchester, here's part of a funeral, one of the victims, 15-year-old, you know, don't look back in anger. Now, again, so what I've sort of said so far, you know, we're giving background history, we're giving a hook, we're trying to get kids in. But again, let's go back to the syllabus and saying, what is the syllabus saying one needs to do in the context study? And let's go back to the very basics. This is a feature of the text. Where there is a historical term, it's bolded, and you can see in situ, you have the definition. And then, of course, at the back of the book, you have the glossary of all those terms. Coming back to, and the ideas, beliefs, perspectives, I mean, if you just look at that photograph, it sets up a paradox. Here you have a symbol of white militarism, Thomas Glasgow, you know, commander, decorated World War I, and here you have Dundalli, you know, warrior who has been hanged on this location. And here you've got, you can see the perspectives coming through. Hero, you know, someone that has been tried and committed a crime, criminal, commemorated, certainly forgotten, and certainly invisible with the history. In terms of, you know, why is that? The British justice system not allowing Aboriginal Indigenous people to give evidence in a crime. So Dundalli never had the opportunity to tell his story, to say, I am custodian of this land and it is my obligation and my duty to fight for this land. And so here he is defending his land, defending his people. But of course, in the context, what we've also got is we're dealing with historical sources, looking at a range of sources, and we're looking at, in terms of the historiography and the nature of history. And here are some of the sources in that particular chapter. And again, it's inviting students to analyse within and have a look at contrasts, and analyse between. So you've got Cook, you've got Phillip, and yet you can see different events and yet there's similarities. And of course be asking questions such as, you know, these were created a long time after those particular events. How would the creators of those sources know, you know, what transpired? And may it have looked something differently? Why might these have been created and setting up this relationship? Again, to make it even more complicated, let's go back and have a look at Cook. And of course, here is a depiction of the same event. Here we've got the primary source from a textbook around the 1950s, and here we actually have a primary source from someone who was there. Of course, the questions then are, how do you explain the discrepancies? And then, of course, you get into, you know, reliability of sources. And of course, then it's another step to talk about, well, how and why is history created, and how are perceptions created? And of course, there's the great jump into, you know, your historiography and the history walls. And students are not only explained in terms of, you know, the 3 cheers versus the black armband, but also that this whole study, the frontier wars, is really going to be, you're going to engage in this debate about our history. So the last thing I want to say about context, and a feature of the book throughout all of the chapters, is that context isn't confined to the conceptual studies. So if you have a look at these sort of pages, here you'll sort of see, you'll find, you know, texts where students will be given within a depth study, you know, the information that goes around. So in this particular chapter, the focus is on Queensland and what happened in Queensland. But again, to set that up in a wider, we'll have a look at the nature of the frontier wars in Australia. Now, going to the depth study, and of course, what's this all about? This is a deep probing of a topic in a sustained manner. And here again, this is what the syllabus is, they're all there, but of course this is where we're starting to get into, we're getting beyond the analysis and into that really deep critical thinking, and certainly in terms of that written communication. But let's start with the devising of questions. Of course, that's what drives an inquiry. And all of the chapters, that's a key feature in terms of they all have a key question that drives and guides what students are learning. So the depth study we're going to focus on is the Vietnam War and give you an insight into what that chapter is about. Now, this is the key question for driving that particular unit, and it is a double barrel. Why did Australia commit ground troops to a war in Vietnam and later withdraw those troops without achieving its objectives? Now, there's a number of questions, of course, you could ask about Vietnam. Why that one? Well, of course, you've got to go back to the QCA documentation. Now, I don't know if you've seen this memo, but you need to seek it out, because this is the memo that actually tells you, again up here, here's the subject matter. Now, what makes this different from the subject matter in the syllabus is that look at the key words, students will including. If you have a look at the subject matter within the syllabus, it does say students will do this, but then they say, for example. So there is a lot of dot points there. How do you find focus, and how do you actually create a meaningful investigation and not just simply go through these dot points and be ticking them off and say, lesson 1 we're going to do this, lesson 2 it's this. So when you actually have a look at the higher order thinkings, this is what it's saying: synthesis, information from historical sources and evidence to form a historical argument about reasons why, entry into and exit. And the evaluation, historical interpretations, involvement in short, medium, long term associated with entry and exit. And therefore, that's where we focus. That's not to say we've gone through and meticulously ticking off and saying, have we at least covered that? We, in terms of making sure students have a sense of what this history about, so when they sit their external, they've got the important context to make sense. So there's 2 basic inquiries, as I've said, here they are. And then, of course, what we are doing in each, we're exploring the factors. We don't tell them what are the reasons. We provide them through, they navigate through a series of sources. And of course, it's being proposed, and then a next source might reinforce that, and another one then might demolish that. And so all the time, it is this process of them trying to set up really a hierarchy of causation. Which one are the most important? Which ones can you dismiss and say, look, perhaps more rhetoric than reality? And likewise, too, it's an exploration of factors. And you can see really the major focus of the inquiry is really the why. I mean, that's the harder question. But here are the factors that we sort of deal with. Again, putting forward, debating, see what the evidence will speak for itself. Let's have a look at the nature of the sources. You've got 58 sources. So they're going to be exposed to a whole lot of sources. 28 of those are visual, and you can see everything from photos, political cartoons, different sorts of posters, maps, graphs, tables. You've got 16 primary sources, parliamentary speak, you can read them, cablegrams, etc., even a handbook from the army. And then, of course, what's really important, I think, is those secondary sources, particularly those historians who give the historical interpretation. What's there? What's their take on why Australia entered, or why it exited when it did. So back to Brian.
The example we're going to give here is from the chapter, obviously, It's to do with the Mila Massacre. I just wanted to take you through the two sources and the way they're interrogated in the book, just to give you a sense again of the flavour. So we're dealing with slightly different source this time. We've got a textual source as well as a pictorial source. So for the Mila Massacre, in particular, we'll be looking at these syllabus requirements, the analysing, synthesising, evaluating and responding to the sources. Now, as background to this in the chapter, the Mila Massacre, single most important influence or powerful influence in the protest movement and Australian attitudes to the war. That's a bit of sort of throwing out to them the sense that this might be a pretty important thing to be looking at. The two sources are firstly an account by Paul Ham of the Mila Massacre, and secondly a rather famous photograph probably, which really instigated the great controversy about Mila 20 months after the event. The questions in the print chapter. So in the print chapter there will be just 6 questions, and again I think you'll see a progression and shift of focus as you go on with those. So responding to the account and to the photograph. First up, what information in Ham's description suggests a large number of US soldiers participated, and is there evidence that any soldiers refused to participate? So that's a question that's aimed directly at the nature of the source in terms of what evidence it can produce. So all the way through here I'm highlighting particular terms because they're terms that of course are highlighted as well in the QCAA document and in any real full-blooded treatment of historical inquiry. So information becoming evidence in some way. What actions described by Ham do you think could be labelled atrocities? And then do you think that those atrocities could then be labelled war crimes? So we're getting into some key concepts in history here. Concept of atrocity, the concept of war crimes. This obviously will need backgrounding. So if you want to deal with that question, you'll have to look at what war crimes are, how they were defined after 1945, and how they became, in a sense, a guide to actions by countries and their soldiers in warfare. Quote, 2 specific details could only have been known initially by someone who was present. So rather than just taking that document and saying, oh yeah, here's a description of Mila, we're saying, in there, can you see some things that no one would have known unless they'd been there on the spot? And so that's an important question about the provenance of a source and the basis upon which statements can be made by an historian like Paul Ham. And we've drawn attention to particularly these terms. The men said, according to the criminal investigation. Vietnamese monument says this. A witness said that. So here we're probing and testing the notion of reliability of evidence. And you'll know that in the syllabus there's great emphasis on the usefulness and the reliability. So often the question, how useful and reliable is this as a source of evidence for a particular question? So this is giving some idea of where this might have been constructed. Who are these witnesses? What is this inquiry? What is on the monument? All of that has contributed to the knowledge that we find packed into Ham's account. What details in the photograph corroborate the description in the source? Now, corroboration is really important if you're going to get beyond the notion that one source is enough. And of course, no one believes that anymore. So we need corroboration in some way. Are there any inconsistencies? One of the interesting things about it is that Ham describes part of the massacre that involved Kelly in particular, and he threw bodies into an irrigation ditch. And yet the photograph I've just shown you is a road. Now that raises the question, well, are we really dealing with the same thing here? And the answer, of course, is yes. So once the students go back to Ham, they'll find hundreds of people were killed. So the 20 or so on the road are only part of this terrible death toll. Obviously what has happened is something that has gone on over a number of parts of this series of villages that we call Mila. And here we get to the sixth question. On the basis of everything they've done so far, how useful and reliable do you think the account and the photograph are as evidence of what happened on that day? So that's getting into the final judgment, I guess, about those two particular sources. It's not the end of the story, though, of course. What further investigations would you want to carry out to answer that question with more confidence? Because we're not going to run with just two sources on such an important question. But there's more. Beyond the print pages, there's material online. So there's an online activity related to these two sources. Exploring the Mila issue more deeply and participating in a values-based activity, go to an online activity. The first part of that online activity is probing two sources more deeply. But these sort of questions, despite the involvement of so many people and the presence of the photographer, the news didn't get out for another 20 months. How do you explain that? Might some people have been reluctant to make the news public? And if so, why? Might some people have been pressured to remain silent? So this is getting into a really complex area of how we ever know about anything. We can't assume that everything that's ever been thought, written, spoken, or heard about an event is public. Instead, some things don't get into the public light, or they get there much later. And this is a great example of that. How could something so extraordinary remain off the public radar for 20 months in the middle of a war that was so publicised? On publication of the photographs, there was strong reaction in the US. Some people claimed that the whole thing had been fabricated. They said the photographs had been posed. They couldn't believe. So the question here is a challenging empathy question. How might news of, How might news of the massacre have affected public attitudes to what was going on in the war? And then if we move on to the empathy question, some Americans reacted with disbelief, allegations, posed, massacre, fabricated. Can you understand the values and beliefs that might have caused such reactions from some people? Why would they seem, in the face of what looks like strong evidence, to, in a sense, refuse it? Say, no, I won't believe that, I can't believe that. There may be a lesson for our own times there. Possible reasons were put forward to explain the actions of US soldiers, and a lot of you will be familiar with this. A popular sergeant had been killed just the day before in a booby trap. Soldiers were already angry. They'd been revved up at a parade where they were told, it was important to honour the memory of that man. They were also told that the village they were going to at My Lai was probably being defended by a large Viet Cong force. In other words, this is a pretty dangerous mission. And what comes out of it? A massacre of people who were there. Can we put two and two together and say, maybe this explains it? A witness also reports that then, without warning, one soldier killed one civilian, and suddenly it just unleashed this extraordinary, widespread massacre. What was it about that trigger that caused that? Now, the two questions here, I think, are really important when we deal with something like this in history. Is there any value in trying to explain why the soldiers did this? Can we just leave it and say, they did this and this is what happened as a result? Did anyone get punished? Let's have a look at that. Or do we want to try and get into the minds of those people who were there? This is empathy at its stretch, isn't it? Can we get ourselves into the shoes and eyes of those soldiers who committed the atrocity, those who didn't join in, those who kept quiet, all of that? So that's a good question, I think. And then a big question, is there a vital difference between explaining an action and excusing an action? Can we try really hard to understand the people who killed on that day without necessarily saying, oh, well, that excuses it, doesn't it? No, they were upset, they were angry, etc. They followed the mob. We're not excusing, we're explaining. In legal proceedings after what happened, Following orders was put forward as an extenuating circumstance, and if I say the words Nuremberg judgment, I mean you'll all nod. At Nuremberg, that defence was rejected in almost all cases. So, do you think following orders should ever be a valid defence for a war crime? At Nuremberg, they actually said it was in a particular circumstance, but generally not. And yet it's still trotted out as an excuse for what goes on. Now, taking it back to the classroom, the Mila Massacre, extraordinary, horrific. Do you find it difficult to empathise with the participants, to see it through our eyes? I think I mucked up that question there, Julie. And is that an obstacle to deep historical understanding if you're having trouble empathising? I might have copied the wrong one in there. Now, this is the question for the classroom. Discuss, is it appropriate for senior history students to study such a barbaric event as the Mila Massacre using such horrific text and images? And that's a question you might want to negotiate with your students, and I'm sure you do, when you're deciding what you will and won't deal with and what you will and won't bring into the classroom in terms of source material. The second online activity, debating a values-based issue, it's going to centre around, we're still in the process of writing this because this came out just at the weekend. Some of you may have seen this, it was in the Sydney Morning Herald. The same story, I think, appeared in the Australian. Australia 2018, echoes of the debates about My Lai. Allegations that members of the SAS have been doing terrible things in Afghanistan. And one accused in all of this is Ben Roberts-Smith as the Victoria Cross winner, and I'm sure you've come across that. Now, what's happened about that is this. Brendan Nelson, who's not just War Memorial Director, but also, of course, was once a Cabinet Minister, came out and said, war's a messy business, as far as I'm concerned, unless there have been the most egregious breaches of laws of armed conflict, we should leave it all alone. Now, interestingly, in response, one of the historians who came out was Peter Stanley, who was not just a UNSW professor, but he also, of course, was at the Australian War Memorial until recent times. So he says we need to know the truth, whatever it is. As a nation, our commitment to honesty and accountability should impel us to acknowledge our defenders' actions in wars, whatever they may be, and to decide on consequences with compassion for both victims and perpetrators. So we can bring those two statements to students and then set them up with an activity which you could word like this. You could simply say, what do you think about two statements? Or you might phrase it in a different way. Choose a personal position in support of one of the two statements below and then discuss it, etc., and get into a debate. Now, what are the two statements? On this side, we should accept that during intense fighting, our soldiers can sometimes commit acts that contravene the laws of armed conflict. And I've phrased it as our soldiers to try and put it in an Australian context. So they think, yeah, we're dealing with Australian soldiers here. So what do we reckon about this? Versus every action by our soldiers that possibly contravenes the laws of armed conflict should be reported, investigated and punished appropriately. And I think that'd be a very interesting debate to have in the classroom. Again, people will probably want to go back and say, show me these laws of armed conflict. So we'd have to get the UN conventions on warfare, UN conventions on treatment of prisoners, all those sorts of things. And I think that'd be a very valuable bit of learning in the classroom. I'm going to talk a bit about the concluding study. I'll make it brief. The official line on the concluding study is it's providing coherence to the study, making connections to the contemporary world and students' lives. That's a nice statement. Is it yours or mine? Or is that out of the syllabus?
The first part is the syllabus.
Yep, that's right. This is what the syllabus actually does say in its normally convoluted way. Evaluating evidence from historical sources to make judgments about links between running out of prepositions, topic, aspect and the current world, enduring legacy, recent and related ideas, actions, movements and other events. I just find the text a bit overwhelming. I prefer something that will say something like this. It will bring the chapter's narrative up to date, where that's appropriate, and it will explore some issues arising from the chapter. And I see these as the two functions of a concluding study. And the chapters, because they're different, have taken a different emphasis. Some chapters are much heavier on issues and some are much heavier on the narrative. And that reflects the sort of chapter it is, because the chapters are quite different in the style, if you like. Some deal with a movement, some deal with a country, some deal with, in a sense, an event, like French Revolution. So I'm just going to show you very briefly the sort of stuff we've built into the book to follow up this sort of thing. For example, the Russian study, the concluding study, goes into the legacy of the Russian Revolution, and in effect what it's talking about is the ongoing history of the USSR. So bringing that story up to date, because we thought it'd be criminal to leave that chapter without addressing the fact we now have a new Tsar, for example, in Russia. Here's Putin's almost in two minds. Does he style himself on a Tsar or on Stalin? And there have been terrific cartoons that have followed up both those options. Another example, from Germany, the legacy of Nazism in personal life in Nazi Germany. So here we have the tattoo of an Auschwitz and Belsen survivor. So a story about that. In Israel, Palestine, the chapter on Israel, the question, can peace be achieved in the Middle East? Which of course is an ongoing question. In fact, it's getting a more desperate question, isn't it? In even the last 12 months, we're getting increasing intransigence on both sides. The chapter on France, we have, does banning the burqa contradict the principles of liberty, equality and fraternity? Thus making a very pointed and very important link between a revolution of 200 years ago and something happening at the moment. And the French people themselves are very aware of this question. They're agonising over what they're doing. This is the attitude scale. This is from the Russian chapter as well. And this is about equality, and it posits a difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. So what do we mean by equality? And those two things have a big difference. Socialism, of course, is always aimed for equality of outcome, whereas liberalism tends to say, well, it's about equality of opportunity, and if we make a level playing field, then everyone will prosper accordingly. And the socialist, or more left-wing and communist take on that is to say, no, you've got to really put equality of outcome there as the goal, rather than putting equality of opportunity as the process. It's a good debate for the moment, I think. I didn't put this one up for today, but there's reference in one of the concluding studies to what Bernie Sanders and Jacinda Ardern and USA, Jeremy Corbyn, UK. Corbyn, Sanders and Jacinda Ardern have all, in a sense, and Ardern said it literally, has capitalism failed many people in society? She said that within a day of being elected, I'm pretty sure. And I was stunned. I thought, isn't that an interesting injection into the debate about where the world's going? So in a sense, this goes that way. And there's another activity in one of the concluding studies that also goes that way.